The evidence has been gathered, the stories have been told, and now it is finally time for the final verdict. Stay with us for the ultimate resolution, where justice is finally served to those who deserve it. Hit subscribe now and witness the end of the long journey.
I checked my watch. 6:37 in the morning and I was already at my desk. 23 years of that. 23 years of being the first one in and the last one out, and somehow it still wasn't enough. The system was called PATHFINDER, my system. I built the first version on a whiteboard in a conference room that smelled like burnt coffee and old carpet, back when the company had 11 trucks and a dream of expanding into the Midwest. That was 2001. By the time everything fell apart, we had 412 vehicles operating across 9 states, and every single one of them ran on logic I had written, tested, broken, and rebuilt. PATHFINDER wasn't just routing software. I want to be clear about that because people hear logistics algorithm and they picture something boring. A spreadsheet, a map with dots. What I built was a living system. It learned traffic patterns, driver behavior, seasonal demand, fuel prices, weather disruption. It talked to our warehouse management software, our dispatch team, our client portals. At peak operation, it was saving the company somewhere between $2 and $2.5 million a year in fuel and labor costs. I know that number because I calculated it myself, and then I calculated it again 3 years later when the CFO asked me to prove it during a board presentation. I proved it. I always proved it. My name is Cal Merritt. I'm 54 years old. I spent 23 years building something I was proud of, and I want to tell you exactly how it was taken from me, and exactly what happened when the people who took it realized what they'd actually done. I started at Kessler Freight Solutions in 2001 as a systems analyst. Entry level. I was 31, had a computer science degree from Ohio State, and I'd just come off 2 years at a consulting firm that paid well but made me feel like a vending machine. Same inputs, same outputs, different clients. I wanted to build something. I didn't care about equity packages or corner offices. I wanted to solve a real problem and watch the solution work. The owner back then was a man named Gerald Kessler. Old school. He'd started the company with his brother-in-law in a parking lot in Columbus, Ohio, running produce deliveries out of 2 refrigerated vans. Gerald was the kind of man who remembered every driver's wife's name and kept a coffee maker in his office specifically so people would stop by to talk. He was tough and fair in that order. Gerald saw something in me early on. Not because I was exceptional, I wasn't, not yet, but because I asked questions he hadn't been asked before. Why are we routing trucks through the 315 interchange during morning peak instead of staging them the night before at the Worthington Depot? Why do we lose 3 hours every Tuesday because our dispatch system can't communicate with the client's receiving software? He didn't always have answers, but he liked that I was asking. Over the years, Gerald gave me room to build, not unlimited room. He was careful with money and he pushed back on every capital request, but he trusted my instincts. By 2008, PATHFINDER had its first real version running in production. By 2012, it had replaced 3 separate legacy systems that we've been paying support contracts on for years. By 2015, competitors were calling us asking how we'd gotten so efficient. I never told them. Gerald had 1 son. His name was Theo, and Theo had about as much interest in freight logistics as I have in professional golf. He went to Vanderbilt for undergrad, spent 2 years in New York working at a private equity firm, got an MBA from Northwestern, and came back to Columbus in 2019 wearing suits that cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. He was 32 years old, and he had the kind of confidence that comes not from accomplishment, but from never having been told no. Gerald brought Theo in as Chief Operating Officer. He told me personally, the day before the announcement, we were standing in the parking lot after a long day, and he said, "Cal, I know what you're thinking. Just give him a chance." I didn't say anything. What was there to say? It was Gerald's company. I gave Theo a chance. I gave him several. The first time he asked me to explain PATHFINDER, I spent 2 hours walking him through the architecture. He asked good questions. I'll give him that. But then, about a month later, he came to me with a proposal. He wanted to bring in an outside vendor, a Chicago-based software company called Apex Logistics Tech. They had a routing product, he said, modern interface, cloud-based, could integrate with any system. I asked him if he'd seen PATHFINDER's performance benchmarks. He said he had. I asked him why he thought we needed a replacement. He said, It's not about replacement, it's about modernization. I said Pathfinder was already cloud integrated. He said Apex had a better dashboard. A better dashboard. I went home that night and told my wife Sandra, and she said the thing she always said when I was frustrated about work. Pick your battles, Cal. She was right. I picked that one. I pushed back hard, presented data, brought in our CFO to back me up, and Gerald sided with me. Apex was out. Theo didn't forget that. By 2023, Gerald's health had started slipping. He had a heart issue. Nothing immediately dangerous, but his cardiologist told him to step back. He started spending winters in Florida. The board, which had grown to 7 members over the years, gave Theo more and more operational authority. Gerald was still technically CEO, but Theo was running day-to-day. In January of 2024, Gerald came to me with something I hadn't expected. We met in his office, the same one with the coffee maker. And he slid a folder across the desk. Inside was an employment addendum. A new compensation structure for my final contract period. I was planning to retire at 55, which was 14 months away at that point. The addendum spelled out a retention bonus, $220,000 to be paid on my last day of employment, contingent on my remaining with the company through my designated retirement date of March 31, 2025. It also contained a clause I want to describe carefully because this is the part that matters. Gerald explained it himself. He said, Cal, I need you to stay through the transition. I know Theo can be difficult. This is my way of making sure you're protected. The clause read, and I'm paraphrasing from memory, but I've read it enough times to have it close to exact, that in the event the company failed to fulfill its financial obligations under this agreement, including failure to pay the retention bonus as specified, all intellectual property rights to the PATHFINDER system, including source code, documentation, training data, and derivative works created during my employment, would revert entirely to me, the original author of record, within 30 days of the breach. I read it 3 times sitting at that desk. Then I said, Gerald, does your legal team know about this? He smiled. Eleanor drafted it herself. It's airtight. Eleanor was the company's longtime general counsel. She'd been with Kessler since 2004. If Eleanor drafted it, it was airtight. I signed it. I went home and told Sandra. She went quiet for a moment and then said, that man has been watching out for you for 23 years. She was right about that too. 2024 was a complicated year. Gerald spent most of it in Naples, Florida. Theo ran the Columbus office with the energy of someone who believed he was transforming the company and the attention span of someone who'd never had to maintain anything he built. He hired 3 new VPs in 8 months. 2 of them were gone by October. There was a merger in the works. Kessler had been approached by a regional freight conglomerate called Redstone Distribution Partners. Redstone was out of Charlotte, North Carolina, and they were acquiring regional players to build a national footprint. The deal on the table was valued at somewhere between $380 and $410 million, depending on final due diligence. The anchor of Kessler's valuation, the thing that made Redstone willing to pay a premium, was Pathfinder. Our operational efficiency numbers were unlike anything else in the regional freight space. Redstone's own analysts said so in their preliminary report, which I was shown as part of the due diligence process. I was asked to participate in 4 separate technical meetings with Redstone's team between June and November 2024. I walked them through Pathfinder's architecture, its performance history, its integration capabilities. Their lead analyst, a woman named Dr. Tekshri, Kim, told me after one of those meetings that she'd been evaluating logistics software for 12 years and had never seen a proprietary system this mature. That was a good day. Theo sat in on 2 of those meetings. He didn't say much. When he did speak, it was usually to agree with something Dr. Tree, Kim said. He was smart enough to know he didn't understand what we were discussing. The merger was expected to close in the first quarter of 2025. My retirement date was March 31, 2025. I had done the math. The timing was not a coincidence. On a Wednesday morning in early February 2025, I got a call from HR asking me to come to a meeting at 2 o'clock. No agenda listed. Just a meeting request from HR and Theo. I knew what it was before I walked in. Theo was sitting at the head of the conference table. The HR director, a man I'd never fully trusted, was in the chair to his left. There was a folder on the table in front of the empty seat across from them. Theo didn't make small talk. He said the company was restructuring its technology leadership in advance of the merger. Close Serrate. My role was being eliminated. Effective Friday. My retirement was scheduled for March 31st. This was February 5th. 54 days. The $220,000 retention bonus was tied to my remaining employ through that date. I looked at the folder. I looked at Theo. I thought about Gerald in Naples, probably on his porch watching the water. I said, "Does your father know you're doing this?" Theo said, "This is a business decision." I said, "I'm sure it is." I signed the termination acknowledgement. I didn't say anything else. I went back to my desk, packed the personal items I kept there, a photo of Sandra and her daughter Megan at the Grand Tetons, a coffee mug from Ohio State, and I called my attorney on the way to the parking garage. Her name was Lorraine. I'd used her for a real estate matter in 2018 and kept her number because she was sharp and didn't talk in circles. I read her the relevant clause from the addendum over the phone. She went quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Cal, they just handed you the company." I want to be honest about the next few days because it wasn't triumphant. It was quiet and strange and sad in a way I didn't expect. I called Gerald. It went to voicemail. I left a message. Calm. Factual. I told him what had happened and told him to call me when he had a chance. He called back 3 days later. He sounded tired. He said, "Cal, I'm so sorry. I didn't know." I believed him. I still do. Whatever else was true about Gerald Kessler, he was not the kind of man to use someone for 23 years and then discard them 60 days before retirement. That was his son. Sandra handled it better than I did on the surface. She brought me coffee every morning and didn't push me to talk when I didn't want to talk. At night, though, I'd wake up at 3 in the morning and just lie there, going over the history. The 2001 whiteboard. The late nights during the 2008 integration project, the board presentation where I proved the numbers. 23 years of early mornings and solved problems and quiet pride, and a 35-year-old in a nice suit had erased all of it because he didn't want to cut one check. Lorraine filed the notice of breach on day 31 after my termination. Clean, precise, exactly as the addendum specified. The PATHFINDER IP reverted to me. I want to explain what that means in practical terms because Theo apparently did not understand it before it happened. PATHFINDER was embedded in everything Kessler did, every route, every dispatch, every client API integration, the system they were showing to Redstone's due diligence team. The operational engine that justified a $400 million valuation was legally mine, not licensed to them, not a copy they could continue using. Mine. Redstone's legal team found out during a routine IP verification in late March. One of their attorneys called me directly. She was professional and careful. She asked me to confirm ownership. I confirmed it. She asked if I was open to licensing discussions. I told her I was open to conversations of many kinds. The merger close was scheduled for April 4th, 2025. It didn't close on April 4th. I got a call from Theo on April 2nd. I hadn't spoken to him since February 5th. He didn't introduce himself when I picked up, just launched in. His voice had a quality I hadn't heard before, something stripped out of it. He said, "We need to talk about PATHFINDER." I said, "Okay." He said Redstone was threatening to walk. The IP issue had come up, and their legal team was calling it a material defect in the asset disclosure. He said the company needed me to sign a licensing agreement. He said he was prepared to offer me a significant sum. I asked him what he considered significant. He said $400,000. I said I'd have my attorney review any formal offer. I thanked him for calling. I hung up. Lorraine and I had already talked through this scenario. Not because I was certain it would happen. I'm not a vindictive person, and there was part of me that genuinely hadn't wanted it to come to this. But Gerald's addendum had been drafted with care. Eleanor had been careful. And so was I. 2 days later, Lorraine got a call from Kessler's general counsel, Eleanor herself. She sounded exhausted. They talked for an hour. Here's what I want to be clear about, because I've thought about it a lot. I didn't set out to collapse a merger. I didn't draft the addendum. Gerald did. I didn't decide to eliminate my role 60 days before retirement. Theo did. I just read a contract carefully and understood what it said. The offer that came back through Eleanor was structured, not a licensing deal, a buyback. Full acquisition of the IP rights for $1.1 million, plus reinstatement of my original retention bonus. The reinstatement was important, not just for the money. It mattered because it was an acknowledgement of what had actually happened. I talked to Sandra for a long time that night. Megan called from Denver. She'd heard some of what was going on, and we talked for almost 2 hours. In the end, I asked myself one question. What would I regret more? I signed the agreement. The merger closed on April 29, 2025. 25 days late. From what I've heard through people still at Kessler, Redstone renegotiated the terms slightly downward because of the delay and the disclosed IP complication. A clean deal became a complicated one. Not a collapse in the end, but a damage. A permanent wrinkle in the story Theo had been trying to tell. The day after the close, Gerald called me again. This was the longer call. He said he was sorry several times, and I told him each time that I believed him and that it wasn't necessary. He asked me what I was planning to do. I told him I was going to retire. He laughed. A real one. He said, "Good. You should have done it sooner." Maybe. But if I had, PATHFINDER might not have existed in the form it did. You can't separate the work from the time spent on it. I know that now better than I ever did before. There are things I keep coming back to, turning over the way you turn over a stone to see what's under it. One of them is Theo's face in that conference room on February 5th. He was confident. Completely confident. He had done the math. $220,000 saved, merger closes, he gets credit for a clean transition. It was a logical calculation by someone who had never had to understand what he was about to eliminate. That's the thing about building something complicated over decades. It doesn't look complicated from the outside. It looks like infrastructure. It looks like it runs itself. He had no idea what he'd actually done until Redstone's attorney made the call. Another thing I keep coming back to is Eleanor, Gerald's general counsel who drafted the addendum. She'd been there longer than Theo had been alive, and she put that clause in the agreement knowing exactly what it was. A safety net, a piece of quiet architecture that nobody would need unless someone did something stupid. I've thought about calling her to say thank you. I haven't yet. Maybe I will. And I keep coming back to Gerald, to the parking lot conversation in 2019 when he asked me to give Theo a chance, to the folder slid across the desk in January 2024, and the way he said, "I know Theo can be difficult." He knew who his son was, and he knew what might happen, and he built a protection into the contract because he was, even at the end of his active years, still looking out for people who'd looked out for him. 23 years. That's a long time to work for someone, long enough to learn who they really are. Gerald Kessler was a man who kept his word across decades, who remembered drivers' wives' names, who built a company out of 2 refrigerated vans and a handshake, and who, in his last real act as the owner of that company, made sure the person who built its most valuable asset would not be left with nothing. I think about that a lot. I'm retired now. Sandra and I took a trip to Montana in May, something we'd been talking about for years and never done. We drove instead of flew, which was her idea, and it was the right call. We stopped in places we'd never heard of and stayed longer than we planned in a small town in Wyoming because we didn't feel like leaving. Megan met us in Bozeman for 4 days. We hiked more than I expected my knees to allow. On the last morning in Montana, I was sitting outside the cabin before anyone else was up, drinking coffee and watching the light come across the mountains. I had my phone in my pocket and it buzzed. A news alert. A freight industry publication had a brief piece about the Kessler Redstone deal. It mentioned the delayed closing due to due diligence complications and noted that Theo Kessler had stepped back from his COO role to pursue other interests. I turned my phone face down and watched the mountains. Some things you fight for because they're worth fighting for. Some things you protect because you built them with your own hands over more than 2 decades and they deserve to be protected. And some things, the rarest things, protect you back. Because someone who understood what they were watching decided to make sure of it. I finished my coffee. The light kept moving across the ridgeline, slow and quiet and completely indifferent to the logistics industry. I didn't miss a single thing. I've had a lot of time to sit with what happened. That's one of the things retirement gives you that nobody warns you about, the time to actually think instead of just react. What I keep coming back to isn't the money. It isn't the IP, or the merger delay, or the look on Theo's face the one time I imagined it after his call in April. What I keep coming back to is a much simpler question. What kind of person do you become over 23 years of showing up? Because here's what I know now, that I couldn't have articulated when I was 31 years old, sitting in a building that smelled like burnt coffee. The work you do in good faith. The real work. The kind where you're solving a problem nobody asked you to solve because you could see it needed solving. That work accumulates. Not in a bank account. In something harder to measure and harder to take away. It accumulates in your judgment, in the depth of what you understand, in the quiet confidence that comes from having been tested by real problems and not flinching. Theo could eliminate my role. He could pull a folder across a conference table and read words off a termination notice and feel like he'd won something. What he couldn't do, what nobody can do, is reach back through 23 years and undo the knowledge I built, the relationships I maintained, the care I put into every version of that system. He thought he was cutting a cost. He had no idea he was pulling a load-bearing wall. That's not luck. That's the long-term return on integrity. Gerald understood something that his son hadn't learned yet, maybe still hasn't. When you treat people well over a long time, when you're honest with them and you protect them when it costs you something, you build a kind of trust that has real structural weight. Gerald put that clause in my contract, not as a legal maneuver but as an act of conscience. He knew what might happen. He made sure I wouldn't be left with nothing. And because he did that, because he thought past his own immediate interests and considered what was fair, the outcome of this whole situation was shaped by his decency rather than his son's calculation. I think about that when I hear people say that ethics is just something you perform for appearances. It isn't. Ethics is a form of intelligence, the long kind, the kind that plays out over decades instead of quarters. Theo made a smart short-term move and a catastrophic long-term one, and the reason he couldn't see the difference is that he'd never had to think past the next meeting. The three things I'd tell anyone starting out, starting a career, starting a project, starting anything that matters, are these: do the work honestly, even when no one is watching and the shortcut is right there. Build things that actually function, not just things that look good in a presentation. And understand the agreements you sign, because the people who drafted them carefully were thinking about futures you haven't imagined yet. I didn't collapse that merger. I just read a contract. The collapse, or near collapse to be accurate, was the result of decisions Theo made long before I ever left that building. I was just the point where the consequences caught up. Sandra asked me once, after everything settled, if I felt vindicated. I thought about it for a while. The honest answer is no, not exactly. Vindication would imply I'd been waiting for it. I hadn't been waiting, I'd been building. There's a difference, and it took me until Montana, sitting outside with coffee and watching the light move across the mountains, to understand it clearly enough to say it out loud.